Welcome back to Cheap Pop, everybody. I'm Derek Kirby, joined again by my friend Matthew Carlin, and we are getting into the thick now of the Neon Genesis Evangelion series. I told you last episode I was particularly excited for you to get to these two because this is, for me, the real takeoff point. Like, Ray Part 1 and 2 are interesting, but the Works of Man and Asuka Arrives in Japan, I think is what episode 8 is called.
Oh, Asuka.
These episodes are fantastic. And I feel like they expand the world a little bit too. So we got a little bit of insight previously to Nerve. We're going to open this up now and we're going to get a broader idea of what these other countries are even doing, how they're kind of jostling and positioning the politics, if you will, to try and lead this effort. So very cool stuff on deck for today's episode. Now, this is very fresh for you, right? You just watched these earlier today or this morning?
Yeah, I watched one last night and then one like an hour or two ago, maybe.
Okay, yeah. And what were your general takeaways from that? Like, just general impression. We'll get into the plot points here in a minute.
So episode 7, I was like, okay, I love this episode. Like, that's probably the first episode where I was like, we're just like, the pacing is great, the story is great, like everything's killing it right now. And then episode 8, I was just like, dear God, I'm hooked. This is my show now.
Yep. Yeah, it's really cool. So the Works of Man takes a different approach here. We don't actually have an angel in that episode, but honestly, they find a way to kind of create that conflict and sense of tension even without it. The episode opens with Shinji eating in the kitchen. He's kind of got a grumbly look on his face. Misato comes out, immediately slams a beer. That's on par. And Shinji's kind of grumbling. He's embarrassed because she's just a slob and, opening her day with a beer. And she's like, if you go back centuries, Japanese have always started their day with this and sake. And he's like, yeah, maybe you. Like, maybe that's what you're telling yourself, basically.
And her eye just starts twitching and responding to him. She's not having it. She's like, this shit comes into my house and tries to tell me what to do or what not to do. This is not just a girl enjoying a beer, mind you. Like, she is beat, has no energy whatsoever, and the second she pretty much shotguns that beer, she looks like a crackhead that just found a rock. Like, her whole life changes in that moment where she pounds that first beer, and then this huge smile is on her face.
Oh yeah, she like yells out.
Insanity.
Yeah, she's like,
so happy to get her fix in.
Yeah. And I think she grabs another one too, but she actually sips that one. So she like shotguns the first one and then like immediately grabs another, and she's just going to kind of sip on that as if it's like her morning coffee at that point. But in that interaction, Shinji we see he's kind of embarrassed by her and everything, thinks she's a slob. Apparently it was her day to make breakfast and she slept in. But all the same, while he is giving her sass, her internal dialogue does kind of express like she's happy to see him, quote, letting his hair down finally. Like, he's kind of settling in enough that he's not just being all polite, like, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. Like, he's actually kind of pushing back and all that a little bit. You see him becoming more comfortable in his surroundings, which is good, because that's been a thing for him where, right, we just wasted an entire episode more or less with the hedgehog's dilemma about just, are they able to be around each other, or are they going to just push each other away, sort of thing. So yeah,
I was definitely throwing some shade in her direction.
Oh yeah, and he's not even, I don't even know if it's shade necessarily, is he's just like completely wrecking her shit. He's basically like, you're a fucking slob, you got to do something about this is ridiculous. But in that, she's going to be gone. At her and Ritsuko are going to basically what would you call it? It's like a brunch and like a demo for another organization's man-made mech suit that they're unveiling. Mm-hmm. And like, this is like a huge deal. Nerve is the only organization kind of doing this, but the difference is this is not an Eva that's being built. This is basically a purely giant robot, and its potential is it has no pilot. It's completely remote controlled, and it's self-powered. There's no auxiliary power, the umbilical cord sort of thing we've talked about before. So there is some potential, but we see Ritsuko and Misato going there basically to kind of not just observe and see what they can learn about it, but they're ready to basically push back. Like Ritsuko especially immediately in the Q&A session of the presentation snatches up the microphone and just immediately starts taking the guy to task, the presenter, kind of challenging how safe his new technology and all of that is. And they're throwing barbs back and forth.
Before we go too far into this, I think we're skipping past the Eva interaction a little bit earlier in the episode, where he's talking about kind of questioning what the Evas are.
Uh-huh.
And he's questioning the Eva. He's saying that there was blood in the entry port. So he's like really trying to figure out what this is. Yeah, Shinji, when he's talking about the Eva. Mm-hmm. Which really like got me thinking like, okay, what is going on here? Because like, we got the picture of the eye that he sees a little bit earlier in the series. We know that there's some sort of creature type thing going on here, just not exactly sure what it is, or why it requires power, I guess. So I'm still a little confused on how this whole thing works, but I thought that was interesting. And then we get some conversation about some different units that are being built. Like they talk about Unit 2 and Unit 6 and 8 and some like funding problems that they've been having. Yeah, which to this point, I don't think we've really talked about any other units being built with the exception of 0 and 1. So we're kind of like getting into there's a lot more down the track than we thought there was.
Yeah.
And then we get into this conversation about the robot version.
Yes, and that's good context too, because that's stuff that's easy to gloss over, and obviously I just did there. So that's part of the struggle for funding, because the United Nations are basically who are funding these projects. So this other coalition basically creating this man-made robot that doesn't require a pilot, can be operated remotely, and doesn't have the same risk of the auxiliary power and power down, fiasco that seems to happen regularly. That's a big deal. That could take a lot of funding, if not completely, wipe out NERV basically in the funding department, and they take over, supplant them, if you will. So
and he says the reactor is 150 days instead of your 5 minutes, which is a pretty significant difference there.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the big thing, even in that, that you reference like the other Eva units that they're trying to finish or that they've been working on developing. That's the thing. It's not like they're just putting all their eggs in the one basket of like, okay, well, Unit 0 is the prototype, Unit 1 is this one, and this is just all we got. Like they're trying to develop more Evas and bring more into it, but it requires a shit ton of funding, as this conversation kind of, illuminates a little bit. So as Ritsuko and this presenter, I don't know that they give him a name, as they're going back and forth, he's basically saying that the pilots of the Eva suffer tremendous trauma, and they cannot control their Evas ultimately. If their Eva goes rogue, which they're showing like, almost confidential photos of Unit 1 going berserk from I guess they show you in the second episode, but it's the fight from the first episode. And he likens it with, he says they can't control their Evas. Unfortunately, they're a lot like hysterical women in that way. He kind of phrases it like that, just kind of like, oh, okay, so you just want to like really try to like cut her down just with the extra little sexist comment on that. Okay.
She came after him pretty hard, and
she did
wiped the floor with her in response, and she didn't really have a lot to come back with, because his points made sense until we get to the demo.
Yeah, well, even before that, some of the other things in that conversation, I mentioned the United Nations footing this huge bill. The big thing is in that berserk mode that Unit 1 experienced, the damages totaled from just those couple of battles with Unit 1 are significant enough that the UN had to foot a huge bill that left, quote, a nation's population starving, and that 20,000 people could die because of that. So like they are pouring all of the world's money basically into this program. And it's like, wow, that really gives additional context to like, if a pilot messes up, It's not just like, oh, the Eva was destroyed or damaged, and now we got to wait for a while for it to be fixed and hope nothing goes wrong. It's like, no. Every little mistake you make, there are immediate real world ramifications. Forget the like grander picture of like saving humanity, like just in the day-to-day thing. If you mess up in some way, whether it's someone's, part of their city being destroyed or something like that, you're draining these world economies basically of resources, and people are starving or suffering from disease, things like that, because of that mistake. It's just like adds a whole new layer that just kind of makes you go like, oh shit, okay, I was just thinking about like the angels. I wasn't really thinking about like starvation and poverty and things like that's intense.
You're so focused on this, you're focused on the battle. You're not focused on the little people. It's kind of like when you watch like an Avengers movie and it's like, hey, here's the battle, but also remember that there's a million other people that are being impacted by this right now.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
Which
Sokovia and all that.
They try their best to include, but no one cares. Let's be honest.
No. I liked Ritsuko's point as well. The best argument she makes kind of countering the reactor powered robot is basically like, you're going to strap this huge internal reactor to this giant mech and then have it engage in close quarters combat. That doesn't sound safe at all. You want this thing to get into basically a boxing match with an angel in the middle of a city. Like, that's just like a nuclear explosion begging to happen,
Yeah.
And again, it's always like, you always have to run this through the filter of, and this would be in Japan. So like for them, that would carry even more weight when you make that argument. So that's her best point to it. It doesn't shut the guy down. Obviously, he comes back with the point about the funding in the UN. He also sheds some light that with the way that like these countries were so quick to try and cobble together a response to the second impact, the creation of NERV, basically all these legal agreements kind of make it so that NERV isn't held accountable. They're shielded from any legal action, which is really interesting. And I can understand how that would happen because, again, you have half of humanity wiped out in this disaster, and it's like, oh my God, these things are here. They can come at any time. We have to respond. And then someone's basically like, yeah, about that, I've got the answer. I can develop this program. They're like, here's a blank check with my name on it. Write any figure you want. We will shield you from everything. Like, they basically just kind of jump in. And so like an organization like this, they call it the JA. I think it's the Japanese Alliance or something like that. I think it's basically like the private sector kind of coming together, this coalition of sorts. And they're trying to supplant them and bring accountability ultimately to it by basically having a better solution than NERV. And because that would eliminate NERV's hold on the funding and everything, you would restore some degree of accountability to it, which is actually a good thing that you should want. But, because of how everything has transpired and what we've been following for the story, you're like, nah, screw you. NERV needs to do what it needs to do. We don't got time for this dork. And I think it's interesting, too, that even though this organization has never fought the Angels or anything like that, they know what an AT field is. They acknowledge the AT field. But interestingly, he just says, yeah, we'll have a solution for that soon. He never hints at any kind of solution or anything. Like, just totally glosses over it. And like, yeah, we'll have a solution, too. And the crowd's like, oh, yes, solution. And I was like, man, I wouldn't be that comforted if someone's like, oh, you mean that thing that I don't have an answer for? Yeah, I don't have an answer for that yet, but I will. I'd kind of be like, I'd feel more confident if you at least gave me something there.
Hey, can you explain to me what an AT field is? Have we been introduced on this yet, or are we still waiting?
They've been there since the very beginning. As far as like introduced, they've been shown. The very first Angel they fought, Unit 1 had to rip physically through its AT field. It stands for
Okay, I remember that part.
Absolute Terror Field. It's basically like a force field around it. If you want to go into metaphorical sense, it's the walls that we put up around ourselves, essentially, how we keep others out. And like metaphors and symbolism are laden all throughout Eva. You mentioned earlier about the entry plug and everything. The phrase I've used multiple times, umbilical cord, that is a very specific choice on my part, because it's effectively like how I read that. It's like the power is cut. You're on your own. The entry plug is sort of like the womb, if you will. It's literally the children in these mechs and everything. So it's almost like a return to your starting point, almost like your essence of your life in terms of how you're fighting for your survival. So it's I think you can go any number of layers into that, but there's all kinds of metaphors and symbolism in Eva, which makes it an interesting interpretive work where you can look at it from any number of ways and be like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, but if I consider it like this, then that opens this up. Nice. And it makes it a fun rewatch for me, at least. But let's go into sort of what happens here after this whole exchange. Misato is pissed off, and Ritsuko's annoyed, but she's not really concerned about it. And so we move to the trial, and as you said, shit immediately goes wrong. Like 2 seconds after activating, the JA unit malfunctions, just starts storming through buildings, just like storms right through the main research center, nearly steps on Misato inside that building, and it's just like taking off, and it is hauling ass, and it's going into its immediate overload of its reactor. Like, oh, so we've got a walking nuclear bomb charging into the populace? Yeah, okay, that's bad.
Well, in the second we see them looking, we see all the spectators looking through the glass, and they're saying, hey, you're safe here, everything's fine. And then the two on Nerve's team are off on the corner, on the side of the building, which immediately brings me to think, okay, something's about to go wrong here, and they either know it's going to go wrong or they're involved in it. Right. So I'm not sure what their level of involvement, even after watching it, I'm not sure their level of involvement, if it was just happenstance or they were just expecting something to go wrong, because that's been what's happened in the past. But storms right through the building they're in, almost crushes them to death, and then somebody has to take action.
And the problem there is that nobody is stepping up to do so. So even as it's going rogue, they're trying to issue shutdown commands and they're not being accepted. And Misato basically is trying to interject, like, you need to shut it down. There has to be a master shutdown. Again, this is like what she does for Nerve. So she's like trying to direct traffic, because the presenter, who's now running this kind of war room, if you will, is almost too mystified, just dumbstruck by what's happening to react. He's like stunned and just like, this doesn't make sense. And she's like, you got to get over that and start directing traffic, because you have a crisis unfolding right now. And he has to always say, well, I got to call a higher up to be able to give this command. And he calls them and they're like, wow, you need to call this person. And it like runs through like 3 lines. And it's just kind of
Shin Godzilla. It's all the politics behind trying to make a decision and how easily the buck gets passed.
Exactly. It's the bureaucratic red tape, because anyone who issues this command could potentially see some kind of career ramifications where their career is impacted because they were the one that issued the command, and it's something that shuts down the thing or damages it in some way, or if it fails to damage it, fails to stop it, but they issued the wrong command, something like that. Like, everybody is just trying to pass the buck, like you said. And Misato is eventually just like, all right, you know what? There's a shutdown on board. I'm just going to go do it. And I'm not even going to wait for your approval, because I don't work for you. And the presenter actually does show like at least a moment of like understanding, like, yeah, okay, you're right, this is kind of bullshit. Here's the code word. And it's like hope, which is like, that's not a secure password.
The second you said that, I was like, is this the real password? Or are we just like, yeah, you go try it, see what happens.
Yeah, like, we need some special characters. We need at least 24 digits or something. Like, this isn't going to work. This is begging to be hacked. But they go, and Shinji actually has to be called in with Unit 1, because he has to like on foot race after this JA unit as it's storming off. And his only job is basically just to grab it, hold it in place from the populace, and he's going to lower Misato onto it, who in a radiation suit, because again, it's a nuclear reactor inside going into meltdown, is going to climb in and try to, from the base terminal, shut this thing down using that password. And she gets inside, she inputs the password, and it's rejected. It does not work. And she says, the quote is, "The program must have been tampered with. There's no other explanation for this." As you said, maybe that wasn't the actual password, but it seems like more than likely that is the password there. And the implication is that this thing was hacked, this thing was sabotaged. And so when that's out at this point, we're like under a minute before it, goes nuclear. And so she's trying to just physically push in the cooling rods, like one of the cooling rods, like the most pointless, hopeless thing ever. But it's like, I guess you just feel like you have to try something. And as it's counting down, like 3, 2, all of a sudden you see a cut to a tight shot of code running. And then all of the coolants are injected immediately and it's shut down. And she knows, like, I didn't make that happen.
Yeah.
And so somebody's like, "Oh, it's shut down. Everything's fine. Oh, it's a miracle." And she, her kind of internal dialogue or whatever is like, "Yeah, a miracle that was prepared by someone." Like she knows this was absolutely rigged in some way. And we see then it's Ritsuko who rigged it. And apparently this was on Gendo's orders because she has a phone call with him. And to ensure NERV's control over the funding and resources for the Eva program, basically they sabotaged, little corporate sabotage, if you will, of a potential competitor, which is interesting because while it's unclear to me whether or not they would have, like if Misato was not on board, would they have stopped it? Yes. Would they have stopped it? Because they tell you, like, initially I was like, well, Shinji's there. Maybe that's why. But then they're like, Misato told Shinji, if you're in Unit 1, you're fine. You're not going to get hurt in Unit 1. Yeah. And so it's like, okay, but if Shinji's not there, then it's storming into a populace. Surely they're not going to kill. Well, I say that maybe. Who knows? Gendo's kind of psychopath. But
Ritsuko's not that far away, is she, at this point? Like, what's the distance between her and this robot?
Like from where it's located, that's true. They are still, I think they are still somewhat close enough that fallout could be a risk for her. I know,
but I would agree that a bomb going off is a pretty easy win as a competitor standpoint. Mm-hmm. If your competition literally blows up and kills people, you win.
But even with it being shut down and disaster averted, their credibility is shot to hell. The thing went haywire immediately, nearly blew everything up. Even if only a handful of people know, first of all, it wouldn't be a handful of people because the press was there. This was like a big unveiling for this thing. And so it going to hell like it did, their credibility is shot and NERV has nothing to worry about now. And then the episode caps with Shinji back at home. You see another brief interaction with him and Misato. She's basically like walking around just a towel or whatever. And he's just like, "God, you're so embarrassing. Can't you put some clothes on? My friends are coming over." It's just like, Shinji, pipe down and calm. You should be excited, kind of at least in the realm of how your friends get excited about this. And so they come and meet up with him and there's like, "Oh, you're so lucky." And he's like, "Oh, you don't even know, man. She's a slob. She's totally just immature and not professional or whatever, not appropriate." And they make a point of like, well, that's actually a good thing. You should be happy about that because it means she's comfortable enough with you to show you her true self. That's what family does. And Shinji kind of like, oh. And then he kind of like
sparkles in his eyes and feels all good inside.
Right, because he's never really had family. I mean, not in all the time he's been gone, obviously. So he's kind of realizing like, oh, like it's unconventional, but I might actually have kind of a family structure taking shape here. Like that is a good thing. You're right. Which is a nice little thing to kind of cap it on. It's just like a little feel good moment. And you even saw that kind of developing as well throughout the episode. You saw him taking that level of concern for Misato and everything when she goes to try and shut down the thing. Shinji's like, "You can't do that. It's way too dangerous." And she's basically like, "There's not an alternative. Like this is the only shot. So I have to at least try it." And his level of concern shows that he is becoming attached to her in some way. But it's a very good episode. Like I said, the expanded kind of world building of that, seeing these other countries, these other organizations trying to basically compete with NERV and these alternate solutions. I think it does a lot to build it out and make it feel more three-dimensional. It doesn't just feel like this little bubble in which Nerve operates and nothing else matters as it relates to life and death and angels and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then we get into the real banger of an episode. I take from your reaction earlier, this was perhaps your favorite of the two, which is saying something. Asuka arrives in Japan. This is an awesome episode. Even watching it again, I'm just like, this is such a great character introduction.
Yeah.
So we begin with Misato taking Shinji and his two friends, Toji, and my God, I still cannot remember the kid with glasses name. Anyone who actually listens to this podcast that also knows Eva is going to just be like, he didn't look it up between episodes? Like, I'm sorry, let him say something worthwhile. We don't care about
him. That's why we don't say it.
Yeah, make him matter somehow between episodes and I'll really absorb it. But they're heading out to the UN's Pacific Fleet in the middle of the ocean. And it's here that we're introduced for the first time to Asuka. This is another branch of Nerve from Nerve Europe. She's a pilot from that, and they are transporting Unit 2 to Japan. And what's kind of cool is it's interesting, again, just a subtle little world building thing. They tell you like, oh, these battleships are pre-second impact battleships. And it's just like, even just something like small like that, like, you know, like how we would say like, pre-whatever era, like working in the second impact into that term, still like that's true. That is how someone would address something like Maid or something, some relic of another era.
So post-COVID battleship.
Yeah, exactly. And Asuka's it's immediately a very comedic introduction, but you get a real sense of her character. First of all, the first thing she has to say is like, "Oh, Misato, remember me?" And she's like, "I sure do. You've grown." Why does she immediately have to be like, "Oh, other parts of me have grown as well"? Like, the fuck? Like, child, calm down. Why are you so excited to tell Misato this? Like, very, very
Everyone's horny. Everyone's thinking about sex 24/7. And then we get into the gust of wind, which blows her whole outfit up. To what's the kid that's watching
Toji.
At this point? Toji, yes. Toji sees everything go on right in front of him, gets slapped in the face, and his response, not just be like, whoops.
Even before that, so his hat blows over to her feet. She stomps on it. So he was like basically on the ground trying to grab it. He's irritated that this person has stepped on his hat even before he looks up. So he's basically on his hands and knees, looks up, sees her. Then the gust goes up. So basically her crotch is practically in his face anyway as the dress flies up. You get that then like almost cut to black. There's text, Japanese text on the screen, basically like slap, like as he's getting slapped. I think she slaps him twice even. And he's like, what the hell are you doing? And I liked her line. She's like, I think it was worth the price of your treat. Like just that confidence exuding, like, look, you gotta look. I can't do anything about that, but I can at least make you pay a price for it. And then I'll let you get into his response, then how he tries to one up.
Yeah. So his response is, well, since that just happened and you slapped me for it, now you got to see my dick. So pulls down his pants.
I'll show you a treat.
Which, gosh, I was just like, yeah, this is definitely the 90s for sure, because that didn't fly today. But
no,
he shows her what's going on down there, and seconds later, he's got another slap mark on the other side of his face. So she got him at least twice. Yeah,
so he basically tries to one up her. He doesn't just show the underwear; he pulls down boxers as well. I was like, I'll show you a treat. And she like screams, slaps him again, like, how dare you? Slaps him again. And then his face is just completely swollen and like red. And she just like walks over and continues the conversation. It's just little things like that. I love her character, just how quickly she like brushes things off, the confidence and everything. Very, very cool. We then transition from that scene. She's introduced like, okay, so one of these is and you'll hear it more in this episode probably, the times where they reference the third child, but they'll say the third children.
Oh, third children. So our third children. I'm like, what in God's name are you trying to say? And what is being said? Because our third children just makes me even more confused with the context of what's going on right now.
I don't know. The Arthur children thing is they're referencing like the children, like the chosen children to pilot the Evas, basically. So
is she 3 and she's 2?
She's technically called 2, and it's confusing here because even though she comes in later, she's considered 2. I think because she was already in training, even though she hadn't done it, and so Shinji is the third child. But in the sake of the dub, for some reason, they call him the third children.
Yeah, the very first time they mention it, they say our third children, and then from then on, it's the third children.
Yeah,
but yeah, that extra REN is
drives me insane.
That got missed in translation
and multiple dubs.
Oh yeah,
it's bizarre. But anyway, so she's like, well, okay, so the third children's one of these, right? It's not him, no way. And Misato's like, you're right, it's Shinji here. And she kind of looks at him and she's unimpressed. She's like, all right, so you're the... And I'm trying to remember if she already knows he's Gendo's kid. I think she does. I can't remember. Do you remember if she actually said that? Like, oh, you're here because of your daddy, right?
If there's a mention of Gendo or not at this point. I don't remember it, but...
Okay. Maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. But then we transition to seeing Misato and them interacting with the admirals and everyone in the fleet. And we see just how dismissive they are of Nerve and the Evas and the children. They resent the hell out of them. And they're like, wow, the UN should be spending their money on us. We can deal with these angels. And again, it's just kind of this sense of world building. Everyone thinks they have the solution. Everyone's grumbling about all this stuff. They don't like that they feel like babysitters. And Misato's kind of going along with it. They're like, well, you're on our ship. You're going to take my orders. Like, you're going to listen to every word I say. And she's like, yeah, sure. Unless there's a disaster, in which case Nerve's authority supersedes the Pacific fleets. And the Toji's kind of like, oh, she's a badass. And Shinji even kind of in his head is just like, oh, kind of like Ritsuko. Like, that's exactly how Ritsuko would do. Just that very matter of fact, like, cut you down. Like, I'm not even saying this to offend you. I'm just making it very clear to you. You are beneath me, essentially.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a nice little character moment for her as well, whenever she actually gets to flex a little bit her authority. And again, you got to think, like, Misato, I don't know what her age is supposed to be. I always took it as late 20s, early 30s.
That's what I'm getting from it.
I think she's very young to be in the position she's in, but she does not lack confidence at all. And then we get another introduction here. We get Kaji, who we see very quickly from Misato's reaction and subsequent scenes, has a history with Misato. And after his introduction, which we learned he was sent by that other branch basically to help bring Asuka over, basically like escort her over to Japan. And we cut then to like all of them are at lunch, and Toji and Kaji on their way there, they're similar. There's like a scene where they're crowding into the elevator, and both Asuka and Misato at the same time are like, hey, watch the hands. And both Toji and Kaji are like, what? It's tight in here. Like, it's not on purpose. And it's just like kind of showing like the mirror dynamics of those two pairs a little bit. But at lunch, Kaji makes kind of just a very out of nowhere, thinly veiled, lewd comment at Misato's expense. I'm trying to remember exactly what he says. It's like something like, tell me, does she still make all that noise when she sleeps? Like something like that.
Yeah, she still make a fool of herself while she sleeps.
Yeah.
Immediately like, hey, by the way, we slept together.
Yep. Yeah. And Misato's, face is burning red, and she's like, how dare you? And everyone's just like, oh, okay, well, that confirms that, I guess. So that, again, just a little bit of levity there, but you also see like, okay, so there really is a history between these characters, and he actually can get under her skin in a way that most people don't. Interesting.
Yeah.
Then we see a scene with Asuka and Kaji talking. She's basically expressing like, I'm not really impressed with this Shinji kid. I don't get what all the hype is. And Kaji actually kind of stuns her. He's like, in his first battle, his sync rate was over 40. To us, that means nothing. But for Asuka to immediately be like, what? You're kidding. Like, oh, okay, so that was a big deal then. Like, there's a reason Nerve is basically like, nope, Shinji's the one. For whatever reason, Shinji's the one. And someone like Asuka and even Rei, both of whom have trained for at least a year in this, they're not at that level, even though Shinji's been there for like not even a month, maybe. Yep. That's got to be kind of gutting too, especially for someone like Asuka with the confidence that she has.
I feel like she handles it pretty well, and she kind of rolls with it, though. And she's like, oh, okay, new respect. Moving on.
Yeah. But at the same time, she does feel at least a little bit, I don't know if threatened is the right word, but just like she needs to almost like flex her credentials a little bit now. And so she goes and finds Shinji and basically is like, come here. And she goes and shows off Unit 2. And her line here is, and I wrote it down, really flexes why she's so bold and brash. She says, Unit 0 and Unit 1 are just the prototype and test type, but Unit 2 is different. It's the world's first real Evangelion built for combat operations. It is the official Eva. And so she's talking about that, and she's like, and I'm the pilot of that. That means if you want to look at it that way, I am the one true pilot of this entire program. Essentially, like, all of you should be bowing down to me, kind of. And again, I love the confidence and everything there.
Gosh, she's so cocky, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's a breath of fresh air.
It's a perfect yang to Shinji's yin, if you will.
Yeah.
It gives very good balance between them. And then on cue, there's an underwater explosion as the Pacific Fleet is under attack. Shinji immediately knows, like, what, an angel out here? She's still not had, just like Rey has not, well, I guess Rey's now had done it once, actual battle experience against an angel. So her reaction is like, no way, that's an angel? And she's like, now's my chance. Shinji wants to go like find Misato and get permission, basically like get instructions.
Yeah, we gotta ask.
Yeah, and I love
no.
I love her reaction to that too. Well, first, Misato takes over control of the operations while the Pacific Fleet wastes time trying to exchange communication, and they're firing torpedoes that don't have a prayer against an AT field. And both Misato and Kaji speculate, it looks like, about why the angel would be attacking. They both think it's because Unit 2 is there. Because, again, Unit 2 is like kind of being hush-hush snuck over. And so they think like, oh, okay, the angels must somehow know about Unit 2 and they're trying to attack now. So then Shinji's like, well, we got to get permission to pilot Unit 2. And Shinji doesn't have a suit, obviously. His unit is not there. So he has to put on Asuka's spare suit, which is hilarious looking because it's very clearly fitted for a young woman, not for a 14-year-old boy. And Asuka's reaction, I love her reaction to him saying like, oh, we gotta ask permission. She's like, I'll ask her permission after I claim my victory. Like, that's just the most like badass line. Like, it's arrogance and it could absolutely backfire, but it perfectly, like, even just to this point of her character, you're like, all right, I see everything this character is and I freaking love it. This is the most entertaining character yet. Even if it's going to be something at some point where, you know, she'll, you think, have to get knocked down a peg or something. It's just like, whatever. This is a breath of fresh air. I'm here for it.
I think my notes I wrote, only a child has this level of confidence.
I don't know about only a child, but it's much more believable for sure. Especially one with no combat experience. Everything's been simulators, and she's like, yep, this is my victory coming. I liked too when they first get in. Now the difference is Shinji being in her cockpit, as opposed to like when Shinji's friends were there, he's at least another Eva pilot, but even still they have to kind of address like she's German and his thoughts are in Japanese. And so it's still kind of confusing the Eva. And so she's like, you gotta stop thinking in Japanese. You have to think in German, which I can't think of a more difficult thing to take someone's like default internal monologue and tell them to just translate it on the spot. And Shinji's like barely knows any German. He's like struggling.
He's trying his best.
Yeah, she's like, okay, whatever. And so she just like rewrites the script, basically the settings, if you will, for Unit 2 to switch to Japanese, which she knows better. And I'm just like, again, that's a nice little touch. You know, so many times like this movies or shows, everybody's just the universal English, which is obviously how we're hearing it. But it's still a nice touch that they're actually having to address something like this, having a language barrier be something they have to work around.
Yeah, her level of confidence immediately switching to Japanese, like, oh, yeah, that's a second language to me that I am just completely fluent in. No problem for me.
Yeah, exactly. So
which it's not.
Right. So they activate Unit 2. It's immediately on auxiliary power because it's not hooked up to its power cord. You know, it wasn't hooked up to a power source. And so I love that they're just literally like, skipping from ship to ship. They're landing and it's like sending these expensive jets like tumbling into the ocean. And it's just like such a nice thing. Again, it gives you a sense of scope and also just like how laughably inferior these jets are to like the technology of an Eva and everything. They're just these relics. But they go and hook up the auxiliary power, and right on cue, the Angel, which is massive, it's basically a whale of an Angel, jumps out. And they're facing it down with, like, again, the tactical knife. I guess they don't have a gun on them because they weren't equipped for that. And so the tactical knife is the only thing the Eva has on it by default. Thing is pulled under the water.
This thing is huge.
Yeah.
We're like way beyond the scale of the other two we've seen.
Mm-hmm.
2?
Yes, we've seen 2 so far. So yeah, this is a real giant. And it's the first one that we've seen that's been waterborne in nature. Yeah. And so it immediately drags Unit 2 under. And as we're quickly told, Unit 2 is not modified to handle underwater combat. And I love that they're in the flooded ruins of Tokyo 1. Again, polar ice caps melted. The entire water level raised. That's the original Tokyo down there. All the buildings they're being dragged through and everything. I thought that was a really cool thing. The cable, the power cable, is the only thing holding Unit 2 to the ship, keeping it tethered. And Kaji gets off the phone with someone who's basically telling him, like, yeah, it's kind of sketchy. Just get out of there. He's like, roger that. He just commandeers a jet and takes off. Misato's like, oh, it's Kaji. Like, he's in a jet. He's going to do something. He's leaving.
Well, and we get the idea from that scene, too, which I had Kashi for some reason. So...
it's Kaji, Kaji.
We get the idea that him and Gendo were at least in on the attack. Mm-hmm. And at this level, I'm thinking, okay, how did they orchestrate this Angel showing up? And then I'm questioning, like, what does an Angel do? Are they even real at this point? But
I'll answer that in a second. So they're dragged underwater. They reach the end of the tether. Unit 2 is basically snapped out of the thing's jaws, essentially, by the cable, luckily not torn in half in the process. I love the plan they come up with to fight it, because they're underwater. They're in Unit 2. It's not equipped to deal with underwater battle. They imply that they have the technology, but it's just not equipped at that time to deal with it. So Unit 2 is literally like not responding when Asuka's trying to move the controls. And Asuka's like, what's wrong? Why isn't it responding? And Shinji's like, it's not in the proper configuration. It's in Type B, which I guess is land combat, basically. And
we knew, and her response to that was,
"We don't know until we try."
Yeah, you never know until you try it.
Yeah,
and it's just like, again, the level of confidence is outstanding.
Yep. And she asks Shinji, like, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" And Shinji's like, "What do you mean, me?" And she scoffs and is like, I thought you were supposed to be the third children. Like, just the banter and all that, just like how quickly she like has been so brash and arrogant, and now she's trying to pass the buck, basically, like the responsibility. And again, it paints their dynamic so well. I love their interactions. Shinji's like literally trying to reach past her to take the controls because, like, I guess, I don't know if it's a sync thing that's a little bit better for him, or if she's just like indecisive about what to do or what they can do. And so Misato has to come up with the plan, and I love the idea. It's a refreshing change to see something that actually is a more conventional means of warfare used in this way. So they partially sink 2 of the battleships, and as they're sinking, they're sending them charging towards the Angel. Meanwhile, Unit 2, while in the jaws of the Angel, is going to try and pry the mouth open. Again, they're going through the AT field, and they're going to fire all the torpedoes, basically everything they got, into the thing's mouth directly. And as Shinji and Asuka are kind of arguing and trying to figure out how to make it work, you do get this moment where their thoughts and their dialogue line up. They're in sync. The Eva Unit 2's eyes glow bright, and the jaws are suddenly like pried open as if it was effortless. Right as the ships crash into its mouth, fire, Angel is destroyed. I liked that. I liked seeing like conventional warfare means actually doing something against the Angels, and it's not just purely like, oh, it's the Evas or it's nothing. Even though those are man-made too, it's still just like, oh, okay, that's cool. So if you could work around this sort of thing. You could actually still be useful against the angels. That's cool. Doesn't make it seem like the Evas were just a convenience of like, oh, realistically, we had no other means of fighting these things. Like, you would be massacred probably fighting angels, but your existing technology could at least do some counter damage.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
Which at this point too, now her Eva is Unit 2.
Mm-hmm.
Has a very like specific configuration for her. And I don't know if I remember seeing what his looks like, but I don't remember the control system of his, whereas her is very much like, I'm in a seat, I have these handles that I hold.
Yeah.
And Shinji is literally like sitting on her lap at this point, and she's over him just as the two have become one.
Yeah.
And that's really when it comes online, and then we get full activation. We get the activation of this Eva, and they get the mouth open, then the guns start blasting, and we get this, as you said, we get this miraculous jump onto the ship with just, the cool, typical, like, yeah, we just did it. Wow, What an awesome landing. And power down, fall to the ground.
Yep. Yeah. Again, I love the way that they are able to beat the angel in this case. The Eva still provides the assist, but it's not the one that dealing the final blow, which I think is a nice touch. And we cut then to Misato and Ritsuko is there. They're basically leaving on another boat. And Misato's kind of annoyed about what happened, but she does say like, yeah, but we got some precious data out of it. Ritsuko is like, oh yeah? And she's kind of like looking over the paperwork or whatever. And she's like, Misato, this really is precious data. And what you were talking about, the two pilots kind of becoming one, we learned that Shinji and Asuka working together set a new synchronization record for an Eva. And it only lasted 7 seconds, but that momentary synchronization allowed them to tap into a deeper kind of well of the Eva's potential as far as its ability, capabilities, all that. And that's why they were able to pry the mouth open when they had no prayer of it before. So,
which is the very second they kind of came together rather than being so separate like they were. It's like bickering children the whole time they were in the cockpit together. And at that moment, they decided, like, we're going to be one person. We're going to work on this together rather than being two separate people trying to accomplish the same goal. And that's when we get the full sync.
Yep. And we cut then from there to Kaji in Gendo's obscene office, just a desk in the middle of a creepy ass enormous room with like, not pentagrams, but might as well be very sus symbols everywhere on the ceiling, on the floor. If I opened a door in an office building and saw that, I'd be like, yeah, I'm not going in there. You could be offering me a promotion or a raise. I'd be like, no, just send me an email, please. I'm not stepping foot in the murder room.
So we get to the part in the series where Kaji is going to meet with Gendo. We kind of get an explanation of like what happened there as far as why the angel decided to attack, and it's not Unit 2, which is the reason. It is something to do with this case that's on the desk. So he talks about this, and he says that it's, which the dubbed version I don't think was correct. I looked at the subs and it said a reconstruction encased in bakelite, which I'm not really entirely sure what bakelite is, but he says that it's alive. And then we hear Gendo say that it's the first human being. This is Adam, which this creature looks a lot like, I would say, the angels or even the Evas when they're in their like more primal state that we saw a little glimpse of. And this has me questioning, like, okay, are humans not the same as what angels were in this essential, I guess, Adam and Eve type situation of the original human beings? Are we kind of like an offset of that has somehow come into being? So it really puts into like perspective, like what is the background here that we're trying to imply? Are we going for like a revamp of like a biblical story where we get to learn that these giant creatures made it on? So I'm really interested.
What does this mean? We don't know yet, but shit just got real. And I love this question because it immediately takes the lore and raises the bar onto a whole new level. You're immediately asking so many questions, and you're like, okay, now we have angels. We have these Evas, which are like artificial humans. We have the embryonic, not even remains, the embryonic state of the first human. How does that make sense? Fascinating questions. And the episode then ends with Asuka reporting to class the following day. For some reason, Toji and them didn't expect her to actually go to school with them. Why? I don't know. Of course, Rei did and Shinji, so why would they think anything less for Asuka? But everyone is horrified as Asuka comes in, writes her name on the board, turns and says, "I'm Asuka Langley Soryu. Nice to meet you." This is a fantastic episode. I can't say enough good things about it. It's a perfect introduction to Asuka. The action is great, and it feels, again, we're fleshing out this world. We're kind of giving insight into the politics of things. We're getting a grander sense of the characters and these organizations, how they interplay, interact. And it's just chef's kiss. I absolutely adore this episode. And I'm fascinated to see what Asuka is going to bring to the table as the pilot of Unit 2. But that does it for our time here. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will be back next week with episodes 9 and 10 as we continue Neon Genesis Evangelion.